Okay, so as I mentioned, I just kind of actually wanted to expand a little bit more. So these are some pictures of kind of showing Americans the way we see ourselves. I mean, I went to Roosevelt Junior High. We were the Rough Riders, right? Named after Teddy Roosevelt, the rugged hero in this war. Um, you know, that we saw ourselves as kind of liberating people from other terrible people. Like here, right? Spain is depicted as a kind of dark monster, right? And here, this picture, I think, sums up the direction that U.S. Uh, um, the way that we have like to articulate ourselves to ourselves, and that we've hoped to view from ourselves to the rest of the world. It says here, the American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake, right? So, I mean, isn't that the case? Just as when we went to Iraq, it wasn't called Operation American Freedom, it was Operation Iraqi Freedom. We have this idea that we'd like to portray ourselves, that we wouldn't go into these other countries unless it had a moral component. We've moralized our foreign policy. That's a little bit different than, let's say, the way the Romans would have tried to dominate, in the past, or other ancient imperial forces. Now, I kind of want to point out something here, because we're looking at the way that the U.S. is going to take this battle with Spain as a pretext to take former territories that Spain had, which are going to be Cuba. We're going to get Guam, Philippines, and we are also going to see in the middle of this us annexing Hawaii. Now, in Puerto Rico, when the word annex is means to basically take land from and incorporate into your own nation. Okay, so keep in mind though that before we were simply concentrated on taking land from the Native Americans before we went on this adventure, and the trends that at this time it was common for European powers to try to take over parts of the world. And one of the documentary clips I have on the crash course kind of really addresses that nicely, to put what the U.S. is doing at this time in context to what the other nations are doing. And I kind of feel compelled to take us into a little bit of a heavy place in terms of thinking about what this time period is creating, and who's going to be influenced by what's going on during this time. In the textbook on page 564, it refers to a book written in 1885 that was titled "Our Country, Its Possible Future, and Its Present Crisis." And the quote there is by this writer, by Josiah Strong, a congregational minister. Okay, and this is a Christian, right? He says, "It seems to me that God, with infinite wisdom and skill, is training the Anglo-Saxon race to prevail." Okay, Anglo-Saxon as in the Germanic tribes that invaded the British Isles. Anglo-Saxon, that's something, okay? That God gave the Anglo-Saxon a kind of place in the world. So just as we had the right to dominate the land from the brown people here and get this land and become successful, that seems to be the case all over, is what he seems to be saying. And I'm going to read you something that Hitler writes, who is going to be in World War II. He says, North America, whose population consists in, by far, the largest part of Germanic elements, who mixed but little with the lower colored peoples, shows a different humanity and culture from Central and South America, where the predominantly Latin immigrants often mixed with the Aboriginals on a large scale. And then he says, by this one example, we can clearly and distinctly recognize the effect of racial mixture. The Germanic inhabitant of the American continent, who has remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be master of the continent. He will remain the master as long as he does not fall a victim to defilement of the blood. Now, why am I reading this? I'm showing what I think we all need to understand is that many people will compare Hitler now to a political leader, somebody running for president, or blah, blah, blah. But we don't often analyze what was influencing Hitler. And yes, I'm going there. Hitler, what he wrote in Mein Kampf was that, look, whites, by staying pure, were able to annihilate basically the brown people and make themselves a presence there. See how good that is, as opposed to how it was done in Latin America. And this idea of racial superiority. What we have to realize is that the British and the French and the United States were going and dominating all these other places where there were non-white people and having success in this, coming from before this time and around this time. And Hitler saw the success in that. And we had racial theories to justify that. And you see that in the textbook, and you see this in some of the documentaries. So what I'm saying is, if you look at what Hitler was arguing, he felt that Germany was unfairly being not allowed to dominate other nations in the way the other European nations have. His racial views, his views about race, about Jews, these were common Western elite ideas. Remember the concept of social Darwinism. The idea of eugenics, the idea that certain people should be eradicated from your society, or that you should create like a super race. These came out of American academic circles from the time. Okay? And so if you really look at what happened with Hitler and fascism, I think the most frightening and the most important lesson to learn from that is that he actually got most of his ideas from mainstream currents within the Western world and the United States, but he took it to a level that most people did not think someone would take it to, right? I mean, Ford talked terribly about Jews. Many elites felt that way about them. Most people weren't saying that they wanted to put everybody in gas chambers, okay? But that racism was there. The idea that handicapped people were a burden on society, that was commonplace ideas. So when he starts eradicating them, again, on a large scale, that wasn't something that most people advocated. But he is like the dark side of many political trends and ideologies that actually manifested itself, okay? And in the middle of several other things. Now, I'm not trying to say America is to blame for Hitler, but what I'm trying to say is that at this time period, I'm trying to show how U.S. actions and our own legacy, how it was also affecting the perceptions of other people on the outside, okay? And so we look at Cuba now. Obama's making historic strides in relations with Cuba. Some people think this is a very negative thing, and some people think it's very positive. But the fact that he's the first president that has been in Cuba for a long time, because there was a communist revolution, which is we'll get to that later in this class. The U.S. has had a long controversial stand with Cuba. What's Guantanamo Bay? Guantanamo Bay is in Cuba. It's very cynically, when Fidel Castro, my one professor said several years ago, Fidel Castro is probably barely alive right now. Maybe he's not. They're just like pretending he's still alive. But Fidel Castro was asked about torture in Cuba, and he goes, yeah, there is a problem with torture in Cuba. And then he pointed out it's in Guantanamo Bay, meaning the Cuban territory that the Cubans have wanted back that we still kept and have, which is Guantanamo Bay, is in Cuba. It's Cuban territory that we actually still control, and the country of Cuba does not. Look at how we attained Hawaii. And you read this chapter, the queen there was fighting for the rights of Hawaiians, and she wanted it to be better for them. And missionaries and plantation owners that were involved saw a problem with what she was doing in their interests, and the U.S. Marines was sent to basically overthrow her, and we took Hawaii away from the Hawaiians. And there are still Hawaiians that are want their country back. The same thing with Puerto Rico. And this is also, by the way, what made the Communist Revolution and Fidel Castro more popular than people would expect with outsiders, and even to a certain degree on the inside, because Cuba is really the only one out of these territories that actually was able to get independence by having a communist revolution, although having a very controversial political arrangement, system, nonetheless. So I met a Guamese guy in grad school, and they fight for the rights of Guam to be free still. He was a part of that movement. So again, I don't, and by the way, there are many Hawaiians and Puerto Ricans and people in Guam who've accepted this arrangement, but many have not. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that we as Americans like to assume that we're always on the side of right, that we always have a moral right in our foreign policy. And those of us who study foreign policy see that it's clear that that is definitely not always the case. And sometimes it's 100% unequivocally, you really can't debate that it's not the case. So I think that if we understand this, again, I'm not saying every time that the U.S. goes into a foreign policy adventure that it's for something dark and terrible. And I am not a pacifist, and I have so many of my students who are in the military and family members, and I've had friends and so forth. I'm not disrespecting the idea of people that are willing to serve for this country and go overseas. But I'm also a historian, and I can't change the history. I can't change the fact that much of this, that the official narrative that we want to tell and what is actually studied doesn't look the same. Okay? And, there are people who make cases for what we're doing or what we have did, or say that what we did is better than other things that could have been done. And I invite you to explore those. I think the most important thing for you to do is perhaps later on, maybe you'll feel that I've unfairly portrayed, and some of these documentary clips unfairly has portrayed U.S. foreign policy. Well, I'm glad at least you are being forced into studying this, because Americans barely have an educated grip on this from a conservative or a liberal or a leftist or a right-wing perspective. Americans just don't generally study U.S. foreign policy. And we're left to letting our politicians on the news tell us what it is, and then we just go, oh, okay, there it is. Well, I want to push you out of that, right? And so that's all I want to really say on this for now. I hope you do read this entire chapter thoroughly, that you pay attention to what's in the documentary clip and give some thoughts on this. And, feel free to call me up and have some discussions and some debates. And if there's anything that you think that I've got wrong on this, I encourage you also to let me know, or if you have alternative sources that you think that you would like me to incorporate, I can look into those as well. So that's all I have to say for this, and I hope that you're having a good week.